ready to explore E-Prime and general semantics. This deep dive will uncover some less talked about applications and see how they can shift your thinking.
Cool.
We've got quite the lineup. Excerpts from To Be or Not, articles by Borland, Johnson, Scott, and Johnston,
Wow.
even a sci-fi story about a programmer who, get this, loses his ability to name things.
Sounds interesting.
Oh, it's going to be a fascinating one.
You know, general semantics is all about this idea that the words we use, they don't just describe reality, they actually shape how we see it.
So like if I'm always telling myself, I'm stressed, I'm more likely to, well, feel stressed.
Exactly. And E-Prime, it takes this idea even further by eliminating, wait for it, all forms of the verb to be.
Really?
Now, it's not about banning to be altogether. It's more like using its absence as a mental exercise, to think and communicate more clearly.
Ooh, I see where this is going. Already getting some interesting conversation potential here. But let's back up a sec. Why is to be seen as such a problem in the first place?
Well, to be can get us into trouble when used for identity.
Yeah.
Like when you say John is a failure, it's like you're equating the word with the person.
Right.
And forgetting all the nuances of John and his situation.
Yeah, that kind of labeling, it can be pretty damaging. There's a story about a writer in the anthology, right? Struggling with exactly this.
Yeah, there is. The writer felt so trapped by that label writer, like they had to live up to this perfect ideal.
Right.
But using E-Prime helped them shift their focus from a fixed identity to a process, one that's always evolving. They started seeing their work as like a journey of growth and development, not this static thing.
Instead of I'm a writer, it's more like I write, therefore I'm developing as a writer.
Yeah.
Subtle but powerful.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the other way to be trips us up is, well, predication.
Predication.
It's when we assign qualities in this absolute way, like the sky is blue.
Oh, okay.
Which, ignores that the sky can be gray, pink, even orange. Depends on the time of day, the weather, all that.
It is interesting, though, these seemingly harmless to-be statements. They can box us into such simplified views. Didn't one of the studies we have show a link between overusing to be and, political dogmatism?
Yeah, they analyzed all these political documents.
Yeah.
And the pattern was clear. The more to be a document had, the more rigid and inflexible its ideology tended to be.
Huh. And the U.S. Constitution, with its, fewer to be, stood out as more adaptable, open to interpretation. Makes you think, how much our language shapes entire systems of thought.
For sure. But what if we could, break free from these linguistic traps, see the world and ourselves more clearly, with more nuance?
And that's where E-Prime comes in.
Right.
By ditching to be, we have to be more precise, acknowledge those shades of gray that to be can kind of hide.
Exactly. It's like swapping out a blurry lens for high def. Suddenly you see all the details, the subtleties that were hidden before.
Like that story about the operations research firm. They rewrote a report in E-Prime, and boom, all these flaws in their analysis just popped out. Almost like the traditional language was masking the problems.
Yeah, at first the report just said, the project failed. Vague, right.
Yeah.
But E-Prime forced them to get specific. They had to say, we hit these obstacles, which led to these outcomes.
More accountable. You have to own the actions, the processes. It reminds me of that story about the Bramble, the programmer. He loses the ability to name things after an injury.
Oh, right.
Suddenly he's got to deal with this realization that labels, they're just arbitrary symbols, often way off from the actual object or experience they're supposed to represent.
It really gets at what Krasitsky said about the difference between the map and the territory. Words are just maps, representations, but they're not the territory itself.
It's hilarious, though, how Bramble tries to work around this. He's pointing at things, saying that the thing that does this or the stuff that looks like that. But it does make you realize how much we take language for granted. We forget it's all built on this shared understanding, this context.
And that's where Pinky's continuum of abstraction comes in. He's talking about these levels, B1, B2, B3, and how far removed a name is from the actual object. Bramble's stuck at B1, experiencing the world without those labels, those mental shortcuts we all rely on.
What if we could all, just for a bit, experience the world like Bramble? What would we see if we stripped away those layers of abstraction? What would reality look like in its raw form?
That's a question we'll keep exploring as we dive deeper into E-Prime and general semantics. It's amazing E-Prime. It isn't just about communicating more clearly. It can help us escape those limitations of, Aristotelian logic?
Aristotelian logic, that A is B kind of thinking.
Exactly. Aristotelian logic, it loves that A is B structure. But it can lead us to see the world in black and white, creating these false dichotomies everywhere.
So like saying all politicians are corrupt, or success equals happiness, those kind of things.
Perfect examples. With E-Prime, we break free from those rigid categories, and we start to see things in a more nuanced, more probabilistic way. Instead of man is a machine, you might say, humans, well, they often act like machines, but they also show creativity, empathy,
Right.
a whole range of qualities that set them apart.
So not denying that people can be machine-like sometimes, just acknowledging the full spectrum of what it means to be human avoids those generalizations that, can stifle critical thinking.
Yeah, it encourages us to ask, well, when do humans act like machines? What are the limits of that analogy? What other factors might be involved?
This ties into that idea of multi-ordinality, right?
Yeah.
Where the same word can have different meanings depending on the level of abstraction.
Exactly. And it applies to more than just objects, abstract ideas too, like justice or freedom. These words can mean totally different things to different people. It all depends on their experiences, their values.
Like, the score of the Ninth Symphony could mean the actual sheet music, the musical ideas themselves, or even the feeling you get when you listen to it. All depends on the context.
Precisely. E-Prime makes us be mindful of those different levels. It's a core principle of general semantics.
But is it realistic to expect people to change their language so much? I mean, how practical is that?
There's this article by Dr. E.W. Kellogg III. He suggests this simple but powerful exercise. Try rewriting a paragraph without using to be. See what you discover. It's not about speaking or writing in E-Prime all the time, but using it as a tool, a way to become aware of the assumptions that are kind of baked into our language.
Okay, so it's more about developing a new way of thinking than a new way of speaking, kind of like mental weight training for our brains.
I like that. It's about building those mental muscles so we can navigate language and thought more skillfully.
What happens when you actually rewrite something in E-Prime? Is it just swapping out synonyms for to be?
You'll find it's more than that. Often you have to totally restructure your thinking. Identify the actors, the actions, the relationships, all the things that to be lets us skip over. Take a simple sentence. The meeting was productive.
Okay.
Well, you could say, we came up with several new ideas during the meeting, and we figured out some next steps. More active and specific, right?
Definitely. And that specificity, that could be really valuable, especially in situations where, clarity is crucial.
Absolutely.
Makes me think of all the arguments I've had just because of misunderstandings. Imagine if we could, hit pause during those heated moments. Say, hold on, let's rephrase this in E-Prime. See if we're actually on the same page.
It would force us to be precise with our words and maybe highlight those points where things are ambiguous. E-Prime, it's like a semantic debugger. It finds those glitches in our communication and helps us fix them.
Like those lost in translation moments, but with our own assumptions getting in the way, not just different languages.
Right. And E-Prime can help us be more mindful, too. By removing that is of identity, we're less likely to label people, including ourselves.
Like in the anthology, they talk about how you can't say, I am a failure in E-Prime. You have to say something like, I experienced setbacks in this particular endeavor. Shifts the focus from a fixed state to specific actions, specific experiences.
And that can be so liberating. It lets us see ourselves and others as works in progress, always evolving, always changing. Remember Bramble? At first he freaks out when he loses the ability to name things.
Right.
But eventually he starts to appreciate the experience. It forces him to engage with the world in a more direct way. He notices details he might have missed before.
Like he's relearning the world like a child, seeing things with fresh eyes without those labels getting in the way. The anthology also mentioned that E-Prime can help us escape those linguistic habits that can lead to stress and unhappiness.
Yeah, one of the key benefits is it can help us reduce those knee-jerk emotional reactions we have. By forcing us to be precise, E-Prime can interrupt those automatic negative thoughts.
Instead of thinking, ugh, I'm so stressed out, you'd say something like, I'm feeling overwhelmed by all these deadlines this week.
Right.
It helps you pinpoint the source of the stress, and suddenly it feels more manageable.
Exactly. By focusing on the actions, the experiences, you start to see those negative feelings as temporary, not permanent.
It's about communicating more honestly with ourselves and others, training our minds to be more clear and less reactive.
One source even suggested that E-Prime can help us be more scientific in how we understand the world.
Ooh. How so?
Well, science is all about observation, identifying patterns, testing hypotheses. E-Prime, it emphasizes precise descriptions and avoids absolutes, and that can help us develop those same habits of mind, but in everyday life.
So instead of all politicians are corrupt, which is a sweeping statement, you might say, I've noticed that some politicians engage in unethical behavior. It invites more investigation, more nuance, instead of shutting down the conversation.
Exactly. And that open-mindedness, that willingness to question and explore, that's at the heart of both E-Prime and general semantics.
Makes you wonder how differently we would approach problems, if we all had this semantic toolkit.
For sure. It could transform not just how we communicate, but our whole way of being. But let's be real. Not everyone's going to start speaking and writing in E-Prime overnight. It can be awkward at first. And some folks might find it, well, a bit strange. So how do we bridge that gap between these powerful ideas and, the practical realities of everyday life?
Good point. It's one thing to understand the theory, but actually putting it in practice, that's another story. What are some practical things we can do, to start incorporating these ideas into our lives? Okay, so we know E-Prime can help us think and communicate more clearly. But actually using it, that can feel kind of daunting. Where do we even start?
That's where the art of general semantics comes in. It's not about, rigidly following rules. It's about using these principles as guidelines to be more aware of how language shapes our thinking.
So more about awareness, not like E-Prime perfection.
Exactly. One thing you can do is start paying attention to how you used to be, especially for identity and predication. Notice when you're making those sweeping statements or when you're equating a label with the thing itself.
And then do we have to mentally rewrite everything in E-Prime all the time? That sounds exhausting.
No, not at all. Just noticing those patterns, that can be enough to start shifting your thinking. You can mentally add those qualifiers, those nuances that E-Prime forces you to articulate.
So instead of he's an idiot, it's more like he's acting in a way that I think is idiotic in this specific situation, but there might be other things going on that I don't know about.
Exactly. And that little shift in perspective, that can make a huge difference in how you react.
It's like hitting pause, giving yourself a moment to consider other interpretations before jumping to conclusions. One thing that really struck me in the sources is how much they talked about E-Prime for personal growth and well-being.
Yeah, it's fascinating how E-Prime can help us break free from those limiting beliefs, those self-defeating thoughts that hold us back.
Right. They talked about how it can help us overcome the fear of failure. By shifting our language away from absolute judgments, we could start seeing setbacks as opportunities to learn and grow, not as a reflection of our self-worth.
It's so empowering. You start embracing challenges with more resilience, more of an experimental mindset. Like Thomas Edison, remember, he said, I have not failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work.
That's a good one. It's like E-Prime helps us tap into that same spirit, that exploration and innovation, but in our own lives. It encourages us to see the world as this dynamic process full of possibilities, not just limitations.
And one source even suggested that E-Prime can make us more creative. Yeah, it kind of frees up our minds to see new connections, new possibilities that we might have missed before.
That's where the connection to general semantics becomes even clearer. It's not just about changing our language, it's about changing our whole way of thinking, how we see the world.
General semantics, it encourages us to be more flexible, more adaptable, to recognize that our maps of reality, they're always incomplete and always open to revision.
Like Bramble. He goes from being frustrated that he can't name things to actually appreciating the experience. It's like this way to see the world anew.
His story, it highlights a key principle of general semantics. We should always be updating our maps to reflect the changing territory of experience. But how do we actually do that? How do you become more flexible, more open-minded?
The million-dollar question, right? Any suggestions?
Well, it starts with curiosity, being willing to question our assumptions and explore different points of view, and a bit of humility too, acknowledging that we don't have all the answers.
So it's a journey, not a destination.
Exactly. General semantics reminds us we're all works in progress, always learning, always growing.
It sounds like E-Prime and general semantics, they give us these incredible tools for lifelong learning, for constantly refining how we understand ourselves and the world.
That's the takeaway from this deep dive. It's about embracing that mindset of curiosity, flexibility, and continuous growth.
This whole deep dive, it's given me a new way of looking at things. It's a lot to process, but also Really exciting.
It is a journey, and the more we explore these ideas, the more possibilities open up.
So where do we go from here? How do we keep this going?
Think of E-Prime as a mental workout, a way to train your mind to be more aware of those assumptions hiding in our language, like practicing scales on the piano. You don't play scales in a concert, but they make your fingers stronger. They improve your overall playing.
So it's not about becoming fluent in E-Prime. It's about using it to sharpen our minds, to become more conscious communicators.
Exactly. And that awareness, it can start with something as simple as noticing how often we say is, a tiny word, with the power to change how we think and how we live.
Well, as we wrap up this deep dive, I think the best advice is pay attention to your language, experiment with E-Prime. See what happens. You might be surprised by what you discover.
Absolutely. Who knows, maybe we'll all be a little wiser, a little kinder, and a lot more fun to talk to. All thanks to E-Prime and the wisdom of general semantics. Until next time, happy exploring.